the morning of February 20th, 2025, in a residential neighborhood in Georgia, police responded to a home where two people had been found shot dead inside their own bedroom. Kristen Brock and James Brock, a married couple, parents, had been killed in their bed. Multiple gunshot wounds, no signs of struggle, no signs of panic, and no signs of anyone breaking in. The windows were intact, the doors were undamaged, nothing in the house had been overturned, scattered, or disturbed. In fact, the house was almost unnervingly tidy, the kind of clean that makes experienced investigators pause and look at each other without saying a word, because here's what every detective knows the moment they walk into a crime scene like that. When a home is spotless after a double homicide, the mess didn't happen by accident, someone cleaned it up. And if no one forced their way into that house, if there were no broken windows, no kicked-in doors, no tire tracks from a getaway vehicle, no evidence whatsoever of an outside intruder, then whoever pulled that trigger was already inside when the lights went out. There was only one other person living in that home, a 16-year-old girl named Sarah Grace Patrick. If this is your first time here, subscribe and join a community that uncovers the stories most people never hear. And if you've been here before, thank you for being part of it. To understand what happened inside that house on the night of February 19th into the early morning hours of February 20th, you have to understand what the household looked like long before the police ever arrived. And the picture that emerges is one of a family already fracturing at the seams. Kristen and James Brock were not a couple who hid their problems well. Within the walls of that home, behind the ordinary facade of a suburban Georgia neighborhood, things had been unraveling for some time. There were drug issues, documented ones. There were custody battles, bitter and drawn out, the kind that leave marks on everyone involved, especially the children caught in the middle. And Sarah Grace Patrick had been caught in the middle for years. Sarah was 16 years old, Kristen's daughter, a teenager navigating the already complicated terrain of adolescence while simultaneously living inside a household that most teenagers could barely imagine. She had not been passive about it either. Sarah had done something that takes real courage for a young person to do. She had spoken up. She had reported her parents' drug use to authorities. She had gone to her teachers, the adults she saw every single day, the ones trained to notice, trained to listen, and she had told them she was frightened, that she didn't feel safe, that going home scared her. Let that land for a moment. A 16-year-old girl sat across from the adults in her life and told them in plain language that her home was not safe. And she was still living there on February 19th, 2025. From the outside, small-town Georgia neighborhoods have a particular quality to them. A neighborly rhythm, a sense that everyone more or less knows everyone else's business, that nothing too dramatic could unfold without someone noticing. Houses close enough that a raised voice would carry through a screen door, close enough that a gunshot in the dead of night might wake someone up. The Brock home sat inside that world, ordinary enough to blend in, unremarkable enough that most neighbors wouldn't have been able to tell you much about the family beyond the basics. A couple, a teenage daughter. A house that had its share of tension, sure, but nothing that would have prepared anyone for what was about to be discovered. The relationships inside that home were layered in ways that would only become clear in the weeks following the murders. Kristen and James Brock were the victims, but they were also, to Sarah, the source of a fear she had already articulated to anyone who would listen. Her biological father, Daniel Patrick, lived outside the household entirely. He would later become one of the loudest voices in Sarah's corner, a father who refused and continues to refuse to believe the narrative that investigators would eventually build against his daughter. And then there were the teachers, the school staff who had sat with Sarah, who had listened to her say the words out loud, "I am afraid to go home." Those conversations would come back in a way no one could have anticipated. Investigators arrived at the Brock home to a scene that told a very deliberate story, or rather, a scene from which a very deliberate story had been removed. Two victims, multiple gunshot wounds. Both were found in their bed, which means the attack came to them. They didn't run. They didn't fight their way to another room. Whatever happened in that bedroom happened fast, or happened while they were asleep, or both. The absence of forced entry was the first domino. In the language of criminal investigation, forced entry is what you look for when you're trying to establish whether a crime was committed by someone known to the victim or someone unknown. A kicked-in door, a shattered window, a lock that's been tampered with. These are the signatures of a stranger, someone who had to force their way into a space they didn't belong. There were none of those signatures here. What there was instead was a house that appeared almost too composed for what had occurred inside it. No blood trails suggesting movement, no overturned furniture suggesting confrontation, no shell casings that hadn't been accounted for, and perhaps most critically, no murder weapon. The gun was gone, not hidden under a mattress, not left in a drawer, not dropped in the yard. Gone. Removed from the scene entirely, which meant that whoever took it had the presence of mind, in the aftermath of a double homicide, to take it somewhere else. That's not panic. That's not the behavior of someone who snapped in a moment of rage and then collapsed in shock. That is premeditation. That is someone who, before or after the shooting, made a decision about what would and wouldn't be found. Sarah Grace Patrick told police that she had been asleep, that she heard nothing, that she woke up and found her parents dead. It's the kind of statement that, on its surface, seems like the only thing a traumatized teenager could possibly say. And in a different kind of case, with a different kind of crime scene, investigators might have taken it at face value, might have moved on, expanded the search outward, started looking for the intruder who must have slipped in through some door they hadn't found yet, but there was no other door. And the physical evidence at that scene was already beginning to suggest something that directly contradicted what Sarah was telling them. She had been awake. That detail, that single devastating inconsistency, would become the axis around which this entire investigation would eventually turn. Because if Sarah was awake when Kristen and James Brock were killed, then her entire account of that night collapses. And if her account collapses, then the question investigators had been circling since the moment they walked into that eerily spotless house becomes something that can no longer be avoided. Not who did this, but why. Why would a 16-year-old girl, a teenager who had already told her teachers she was frightened, who had already gone to authorities about her parents' drug use, who had already tried in the ways available to her to change her circumstances through the systems designed to help her, why would she be sleeping soundly on the night her parents were murdered? And if she wasn't sleeping, then what was she doing? The neighborhood woke up the way neighborhoods always do when something unthinkable happens nearby, slowly, then all at once. Whispers turned into questions. Questions turned into fear. Because the thing that was already becoming clear to anyone paying attention was the thing that makes this kind of crime so deeply unsettling. There was no monster who came from outside, no stranger, no intruder. No one who had chosen this house randomly, climbed through a window and fled into the dark. Whatever happened in that bedroom on the night of February 19th happened in a home where every person inside knew every other person, where the lights were familiar, where the layout was known by heart. Someone understood exactly where Kristen and James Brock would be sleeping, and exactly what they would need to do, and exactly what they would need to take with them when it was over. And there was only one other person in that house. Sarah Grace Patrick was 16 years old, and by the time police finished processing that spotless, silent crime scene, they already knew they were looking for someone who had never left by the time investigators had finished their initial sweep of the Brock home. The outline of this case had already taken a shape that would haunt everyone involved. No forced entry, a deliberately clean scene, a missing murder weapon, and a teenage girl whose account of that night didn't match what the evidence was beginning to say. But here's what no one fully understood yet, not the investigators, not the community, not the neighbors processing the news through morning coffee and hushed phone calls. What Sarah Grace Patrick did in the days that followed would raise questions that no one in this investigation was prepared for. Because when most people lose their parents, when most people wake up to something that devastating, to trauma that size, they retreat, they go quiet. They disappear from the world for a while, held together by whatever family they have left, moving through the fog of shock and grief in private. Sarah didn't do that. Sarah went online. And what happened next would change this investigation in ways that no one saw coming. Within hours of the discovery of Kristen and James Brock's bodies, the Georgia investigators working this case had already made a decision that would shape everything that followed. They were not looking outward, they were looking in. The absence of forced entry, the clean crime scene, the missing weapon. These weren't inconclusive details, they were a roadmap, and every road on it led back to the same address, back to the same house. Back to the only other person who had been inside it on the night of February 19th. But investigators are trained to build cases, not assumptions. And building a case against a 16-year-old girl for the murder of both her parents requires more than a clean crime scene and a gut feeling. It requires evidence. It requires a timeline. It requires the kind of corroboration that holds up under cross-examination, under the scrutiny of a defense attorney, under the weight of a courtroom. So they started at the beginning. They pulled phone records. They canvassed the neighborhood. They spoke to everyone who had a connection to the Brock household, neighbors, extended family, community contacts. And almost immediately, they encountered something that began to reframe this case entirely. They found the teachers, the school staff who had interacted with Sarah Grace Patrick in the months and weeks before the murders came forward with accounts that investigators had not been expecting, not because they were shocking, but because they were so specific. Sarah had not hinted at problems at home. She had not suggested vaguely that things were difficult. She had sat down with adults at her school and told them directly that she was afraid, that her parents had drug problems, that she did not feel safe in her own house. She had even reported her parents' drug use to authorities, an act that for a teenager requires a level of desperation that most adults never have to experience. When a 16-year-old goes to the authorities about their own parents, they are not making a casual complaint. They are asking for intervention. They are saying in the clearest terms available to them, someone needs to do something because I cannot fix this myself. For investigators, these disclosures were significant for two reasons. The first was motive. A teenager who had documented on the record that she was frightened of her parents, who had escalated those fears through official channels, who had confided in teachers, who had tried to change her circumstances and remained trapped in a home she described as dangerous, was a teenager with reasons. Whether those reasons justified anything that may or may not have happened on the night of February 19th was a question for a jury, but they existed. And in any investigation, motive is the thread that, once found, begins to pull everything else into place. The second reason was behavioral, because a person who had been that vocal, that deliberate, that aware of her situation, a person who had already demonstrated a willingness to take action when she felt cornered, was not necessarily the same person as someone who would simply sleep through a double homicide happening in the next room. The gap between those two portraits of Sarah Grace Patrick was something investigators could not ignore. The timeline reconstruction of the night of February 19th into the early hours of February 20th was painstaking work, the kind that happens largely out of public view, phone records cross-referenced against physical evidence, forensic analysis of the crime scene mapped against the timeline of the discovered bodies. Details gathered and regathered until the shape of the night began to emerge from the noise, and what that reconstruction revealed was deeply problematic for Sarah's account. She had told police she was asleep, that she heard nothing, that she woke to find her parents dead. The evidence said otherwise. The specific nature of that contradicting evidence has not been fully disclosed publicly. Investigators and prosecutors rarely reveal the precise details of their forensic findings before a case goes to trial, but the determination that Sarah was awake during the incident is central to the prosecution's case, and it is not a determination that investigators made lightly or casually. It is the kind of conclusion that requires corroboration. The kind that gets checked and checked again before it gets attached to an arrest warrant, and it shattered the one version of events that had placed Sarah entirely outside the frame, because if Sarah was awake, if she was conscious during the shooting of Kristen and James Brock, then she did not discover their bodies the next morning. She knew about them before she discovered them. And the question of how she knew, and why she said nothing, and where she was and what she was doing in the time between the gunshots and the moment police arrived becomes a question with only one honest answer. She was there. Then came the TikTok videos. In the days following the murders, while investigators were processing the crime scene, conducting interviews, pulling phone records, and quietly building a case, Sarah Grace Patrick went online. She posted videos, crying videos, grief content. She addressed her followers, shared her pain, and in a detail that investigators and observers found particularly difficult to reconcile with the image of a devastated teenager, she began soliciting donations. Now, it is worth pausing here because the instinct when confronted with this information is to react immediately, to assign meaning to it, to decide what it proves, to let it close the case in your mind before the evidence has done so legally. That instinct needs to be examined carefully. Grief does not have a single, universally correct expression. Teenagers in particular process trauma in ways that adults frequently misread. Social media has fundamentally altered how young people communicate, including how they communicate pain. None of that is in dispute, but here is what investigators were looking at, not just the fact of the videos, but their tone, their composition, the speed with which they appeared, the level of social media awareness embedded in their presentation. The videos were not raw, unfiltered moments captured accidentally by a teenager who forgot she was filming. They were created, posted, and monitored. They were engaging with an audience, and an audience was paying attention. True crime communities online, the networks of amateur investigators, forum participants, and social media observers who have become a genuinely significant force in how high-profile cases develop in the public eye, began circulating the videos within days. The commentary was swift and almost uniformly suspicious. Viewers who had no connection to the Brock family, no stake in the investigation, no access to the forensic evidence, ordinary people watching a screen, were asking the same question that investigators were asking inside the case. Ask, does this look like grief? Or does this look like performance? Distinction matters enormously because it speaks to something investigators call state of mind, the psychological posture of a suspect in the aftermath of a crime. And Sarah's state of mind, as captured in those videos, was not the state of mind of a teenager in shock. It was the state of mind of someone who was, on some level, managing a narrative. Whether that narrative was being managed deliberately, whether it was calculated, planned, rehearsed, or whether it was the result of something else entirely, something more complicated and harder to name, was a question that would not be answered quickly. But the TikTok behavior lodged itself at the center of this investigation like a splinter. It would not be ignored. It could not be explained away. And as the weeks passed, and the case continued to develop, it became one of the most debated and disturbing elements of a case. Already full of disturbing elements, the murder weapon was still missing. That fact, quiet, persistent, refusing to resolve itself, sat at the edge of every conversation about this case like a question that no one had an answer to. Because the absence of the weapon is not just an evidentiary gap. It is a statement. It tells you something about the person who removed it. They thought about it. In the immediate aftermath of a double homicide, in whatever state of mind a person is in when something that extreme has just occurred, they stopped. They made a decision. They picked up the weapon, they carried it out of that bedroom, and they took it somewhere. Not nearby, not somewhere obvious. Somewhere that investigators in the weeks following the murders were never able to find. The deliberateness of that act is what separates it from impulsivity. A crime of pure passion, a snap decision, a moment of uncontrollable rage leaves traces everywhere. The weapon gets dropped. The scene gets left in chaos. The person either flees or collapses. They do not clean up. They do not think clearly enough to remove the one piece of evidence that would most directly connect them to what happened. Whoever removed that weapon from the Brock home was thinking. And that thought, extended, purposeful, survival-oriented, raised a question that investigators never fully stepped away from throughout this entire investigation. Did Sarah act alone? The weeks following the murders deepened the picture in ways that the initial crime scene could only suggest. Extended family members who had known the Brock household from the outside offered fragments, impressions of the family dynamic, observations about Sarah's relationship with her parents, second-hand accounts of the tension that had become routine inside that home. A complex portrait emerged, one not easily reduced to heroes and villains. Kristen and James Brock had struggled. That was not in dispute. The drug issues that Sarah had reported to authorities were not invented. They were real, documented, confirmed. The custody battles that had already fractured the family structure were real. The fear that Sarah had described to her teachers was, by almost every available account, rooted in something genuine. But genuine fear, genuine suffering, does not write the ending of this story. It contextualizes it. It forces the question that sits beneath everything else in this case. If Sarah had already tried the proper channels, if she had gone to teachers, gone to authorities, made her situation known, and the systems designed to protect her had not moved fast enough or firmly enough or at all, what does a trapped teenager do next? And whatever the answer to that question turns out to be, what does it mean for how we understand what happened on the night of February 19th? Those questions were still circulating online in the community. Inside the investigation itself, when the case crossed the threshold that everyone had been waiting for in July of 2025, 5 months after Kristen and James Brock were found shot dead in their bed, Georgia law enforcement made an arrest.
An arrest has been made in the case. Kristen Brock's 17-year-old daughter, Sarah Grace Patrick, has been taken into custody and charged with 2 counts of murder and 2 counts of aggravated assault in connection with the deaths of her mother and her stepfather.
Sarah Grace Patrick, 16 years old, was taken into custody and formally charged with 2 counts of murder. The arrest confirmed what investigators had believed since nearly the beginning. The person who killed Kristen and James Brock had not broken into that house. They had already been inside it. They had gone to sleep in the same home under the same roof, and at some point in the night, while the neighborhood was quiet, while the rest of the world was somewhere else, something had happened that left 2 people dead and a spotlessly clean house as the only remaining evidence that anything had occurred at all. And then that person had gone on TikTok. Somewhere in Georgia, Daniel Patrick, Sarah's biological father, the man who had not been living in that house, the man who had watched from a distance as this family's fractures became something irreversible, received the news of his daughter's arrest and did not accept it. He went public with his refusal. Sarah, he said, was innocent. Sarah was being wrongfully accused. Whatever the investigators believed, whatever the evidence suggested, whatever the case being built against his daughter looked like from where they were standing, Daniel Patrick was standing somewhere else entirely, and he was not moving. The case that had already divided an online community, already sparked national conversations about grief and social media and the failures of protective systems, became something more complicated still. A father who believed his daughter. A prosecution that believed the evidence. A missing murder weapon that had still not been found. And a trial that had not yet begun. There is a particular kind of reckoning that follows an arrest like this one. Not the legal reckoning that comes later, in a courtroom, with attorneys and evidence and a jury tasked with deciding what the truth actually is. This is a different kind. The kind that happens in the hours and days after a 16-year-old girl is walked out of a Georgia neighborhood in handcuffs and charged with killing both of her parents. The kind that forces a community, and a country watching from a distance, to sit with the full weight of what this case is actually about, not just what happened on the night of February 19th. But everything that came before it. Sarah Grace Patrick was formally charged with 2 counts of murder in July of 2025, 5 months after the bodies of Kristen and James Brock were discovered in their bedroom. She was charged as a juvenile defendant, a distinction that carries enormous legal significance, and one that remains actively contested. with prosecutors and defense attorneys navigating the question of whether this case will ultimately be tried in juvenile court or whether Sarah will face the full weight of the adult criminal justice system. That determination alone could define the rest of her life. At the center of the prosecution's case sits the contradiction that investigators identified in the earliest hours of the investigation, the contradiction that, once confirmed, made everything else fall into place with a cold and terrible logic. Sarah told police she was asleep. The evidence says she was awake. That gap between the story she told and the story the evidence tells is where the prosecution intends to build its argument. And it is a gap that, in the absence of an alternative explanation that accounts for the physical findings at that scene, becomes very difficult for a defense to close. The TikTok videos are expected to play a role as well. Not as proof of guilt in themselves, a defense attorney will be ready for that argument, and will make the case, not unreasonably, that a traumatized teenager processing unimaginable loss in the only social language available to her generation should not be convicted on the basis of grief that looked unfamiliar to older eyes. But the videos speak to the state of mind. They speak to composure. They speak to a level of public-facing awareness in the immediate aftermath of a double homicide that the prosecution will use to paint a picture of who Sarah Grace Patrick was in those days, and what that suggests about who she was on the night it happened. The murder weapon has still not been found. That absence casts a long shadow over both sides of this case. For the prosecution, the missing weapon is evidence of premeditation, of someone who planned not just the act, but the aftermath, who understood that removing that weapon was the difference between a solvable crime and an unsolvable one. For the defense, it is an unresolved question, a gap in the chain of evidence that a skilled attorney can point to and say, "Without this, what exactly do you have?" Daniel Patrick continues to maintain his daughter's innocence publicly and without qualification. He is not a man performing loyalty for the cameras. By every available account, he genuinely believes that Sarah did not do this, that something has gone wrong in the investigation, that his daughter is being held for something she did not do. His presence in this case is a reminder of something that gets lost in true crime narratives almost by design. Behind every accused person is a family. A father who taught his daughter to ride a bike, who sat across from her at dinner tables, who knows her in ways that no investigator ever will. Daniel Patrick's certainty does not override the evidence, but it humanizes it. It insists that the story is more complicated than an arrest and a charge and a missing gun. The trial has not yet taken place. The full legal resolution of this case remains ahead. The Georgia community where this happened has not recovered, not fully, and perhaps not for a long time. This is the particular wound that cases like this leave behind. A stranger committing a crime is terrible. A stranger can be understood as an external threat, something that came from outside. Something that the community can collectively define itself against. But this was not a stranger. This was a daughter. This was a teenager who attended school in that community, who walked those halls, who sat in classrooms with other students whose parents are now quietly watching them with a different kind of attention, who told her teachers she was afraid and was believed, and then was left anyway, in the home she described as dangerous. That detail does not leave easily. Online, the conversation has not quieted. The TikTok videos continue to circulate, still generating debate about grief, about performance, about what it means when a generation raised on social media reaches for their phone in the worst moment of their lives. Some viewers watch those videos and see guilt. Others watch them and see a teenager who had already learned that the only place her pain got a response was online. Both interpretations carry weight. Neither resolves the case. What this case has done unavoidably, irreversibly, is force a harder conversation about the children living inside troubled households. Sarah Grace Patrick told someone she was scared. She told more than one person. She told teachers, mandated reporters, trained professionals, adults whose literal job includes identifying children in danger and intervening. She told authorities. She went through channels that exist specifically for situations like the one she described. She did not suffer in silence. She spoke, and she was still in that house on February 19, 2025, whether Sarah Grace Patrick is ultimately found guilty of killing Kristen and James Brock, whether the evidence holds, whether the jury believes the prosecution's reconstruction of that night, whether the missing weapon is found or remains lost. None of that changes this part of the story. The part where a teenager raised her hand in the ways available to her and said, "Something is wrong where I live." What this case demands, regardless of its verdict, is an accounting of what happened between that moment and the morning of February 20th. Not just legally, not just procedurally, but humanly. What did the systems designed to protect Sarah Grace Patrick do with what she told them? Where did the intervention fail? And what would this story look like if the answer to her fear had arrived before the point of no return? These are not questions with easy answers. They are not questions that a trial will resolve, or a sentencing will close. They are the questions that linger after the cameras leave and the community tries to put itself back together, and the name Sarah Grace Patrick becomes a reference point in a conversation about what we owe the children who are already telling us they need help. This case is not over. The trial is ahead. The truth, the full legal adjudicated truth, has not yet been delivered. Sarah Grace Patrick sits in custody, young enough that whatever comes next will define not just her past but her entire future. Her father believes she is innocent. The prosecution believes the evidence tells a different story. And somewhere in Georgia, a gun that may or may not hold the final answer to this case remains missing. What we are left with for now is the outline of something deeply tragic in every direction for everyone involved. 2 people are dead. A 16-year-old is charged with killing them. A family is destroyed. A community is shaken. And the question of what could have been different, what intervention, what response, what moment of genuine action might have redirected all of this toward a different ending, hangs over everything. If this story has moved you, if it has made you think about the children in your own community who might be quietly asking for help in rooms where the adults aren't quite listening, let that sit with you. Share your thoughts in the comments. This is the kind of case that deserves more than passive attention. And if you want to follow more investigations like this one, cases that go beyond the surface, that ask the harder questions, subscribe and stay with us. There is always another story. And some of them start exactly like this one did, with a house that was too quiet, and a door that was never forced open. See you in the next video.